Hey y'all, here at OS Reviews. Today we're taking a revisited look at the Samsung Galaxy S9 Plus here in 2023. This phone was released back in 2018, making it now about 5 years old, which is crazy because it doesn't seem like too long ago when this phone was considered as one of the halo phones in the Android world. Anyways, we recently did a revisited review on the Samsung Galaxy S10e, which is, again, pretty similar to the S10, considered as the next generation model from Samsung, but this is going to be a slightly older device, and if you're considering one today, you can easily find it for under $100 when shopping around. In this case, we're looking at a 6.2-inch OLED display which has a 2K resolution, support for HDR10, super punchy and contrasty like most premium Samsung panels. So we can see how the content slightly flows off from the left and right sides of the phone, and it's not completely flat. The glass here is physically tapered down. This is the regular S8, by the way, which has the same dimensions as the S9, but you get a better idea of how much larger the S9 Plus is in comparison. One other benefit of the Plus edition, though, was a larger battery. This one coming in at 3,500 milliamp hours, could last a little bit longer, especially if you lowered the screen resolution to something like Full HD, and using the night mode, it can last you for about a day and a half, and also having more RAM, 6 gigabytes to be precise, compared to 4 gigs on the base model. This is, of course, a much larger phone than the S10e that is actually sitting in a pretty similar price range now if you're shopping around, maybe just about $10 to $20 more. So in terms of performance and power, right off the bat, I will say that the S10e is a better purchase. If you're looking for a newer chipset, that one is using the Snapdragon 855 compared to the 845, one generation older on this, which is a 10 nanometer architecture, so slightly less energy efficient as well, but still octa-core, and still a relatively fast performer, at least when it comes to general system navigation. However, if you're purchasing the regular version of the S10 or the S10 Plus with a similar size display, those phones will often be much more expensive. Coming back into the design, even though it doesn't look too different from the S8, it's still quite clean because Samsung didn't really go with the trend and add any notches on their display, but symmetrical bezels on the top and bottom, which, although a little bit larger by 2023 standards, it keeps the display beautiful and uninterrupted. It also makes it pretty easy to swipe for gestures, and the top also houses the speaker that also serves as a stereo pair with the bottom one, front-facing camera, along with even an iris scanner as well for better biometrics if you didn't want to use the fingerprint scanner, which on this model is still located on the back of the phone, but nothing wrong with that. It's still a pretty fast and responsive sensor, and perhaps more importantly, the placement is vastly superior to that of the S8, making it easy to smudge up the lens. On here, it just makes a lot more sense. What was also retained from the S8 is also a pressure-sensitive region on the bottom section of the display that you can press on with a little bit of force to wake up the screen from sleep. So it's not really an under-display fingerprint scanner. That tech wasn't available back in 2018 just yet, but it was similar to 3D Touch on iPhones and gave you a pretty nice haptic vibration when you're waking the phone from sleep. Kind of an interesting extra that was unfortunately later on removed with the S10 series. The black version of the phone, though, is very stealth-like. Even the aluminum rails have this powdered texture as opposed to the shiny aluminum being used on the S10 as well as the S8. It curves off and gets access to the volume rocker as well as the Bixby key. The bottom of the phone houses the traditional 3.5mm headphone jack. Again, another benefit of picking up a slightly older phone if you are listening to a lot of music with higher quality headphones. You have the Type-C port. There's also access to the power key on the left-hand spine, along with the SIM card tray at the very top of the phone. In terms of the camera situation, we had access to a primary 12 megapixel lens with optical image stabilization, and then a secondary 12 megapixel telephoto 2x zoom can also be found here, but there was no wide-angle lens on the S9 series, which is something to keep in mind. There is, however, a LED flash along with a heart rate monitor that has been since removed, starting with the S10 devices. And as a flagship, of course, it has all the sensors that you would possibly expect, including NFC for contactless mobile payment. There is also access to Qi wireless charging at 15 watts, although there is no reverse charging quite yet. Wi-Fi AC, but not quite Wi-Fi 6, 4G LTE, and Bluetooth 5.0 are all staples that you'll find. Going into the software situation next, we have Samsung's One UI 2.5 on here, so it can be upgraded all the way up to Android 10.0. Definitely not the newest version of Android, but still looks surprisingly up to date in terms of how the UI elements are still curved, and that whole One UI experience, including access to some software shortcuts using the bar here on the side with that curved display, all still feel quite current. But it's also one thing to keep in mind if you are purchasing an older phone, is that you don't necessarily get the latest software updates really moving forward, although at this point you can still install any content from the Play Store really without any problems. Otherwise, in terms of built-in applications, there is a lot going on. Like most Samsung phones, it's the whole kitchen sink approach. Everything is highly customizable, which is good, but they also include just a ton of their own apps, including versions of utility tools like calculators, voice recorders, memos, that are in addition to the stock Google apps. It's really not as bad as it was back in the day, and things have already been slightly tuned down. Jumping into the camera performance next, as a whole, I would say this is still very competent, especially for a 2018 device. The presence of the telephoto zoom is also handy if you are constantly trying to get closer to your subjects, and there isn't really a huge drop in terms of quality either, transitioning between those two lenses because they have the same 12 megapixel resolution. Color science is also pretty similar. Zooming beyond this point though will all be done digitally, but you still have a fair amount of detail, I'd say. Of course, I would argue that a wide-angle lens might be a little bit more practical, especially since 2x optical zoom really isn't a huge difference, but it is what it is, and I think still better than a lot of budget phones and even mid-tier phones that you can often find for the same sub-$100 price point when you're shopping around. Some software tricks here include AI scene detection. You can change things such as various built-in filters, and even capture raw images for further editing, as well as HDR can all be further applied. Video recording can also be captured up to Ultra HD or 4K. Finally, under More, just like on the S10e that we saw, there are pro modes for adjusting ISO, bokeh portraits, although you don't get bokeh video on this phone, and there are also slow motion effects you can play around with, and perhaps more importantly, also a night mode as well, which will increase the exposure time to let in more light. Of course, the effect is not going to be to the same level as newer Pixels and iPhones, but it's still nice to find, and definitely makes a difference if you are in darker situations. The OIS is also helping mitigate some of the shakiness as well. In general, it's really not a bad performer at all. In fact, I would say it's quite similar to something like the original and second generation Pixels in terms of the level of performance that you can get, give and take. Samsung phones though do have a little bit more of saturated looking colors, but overall not bad at all. And like we talked about earlier, one of the benefits of having a more popular flagship of yesteryear is more community support. So you can easily install third-party apps like Gcam, which is a port of the Pixel camera software onto this phone, and you're able to get sometimes better quality results at night, as well as slightly more accurate looking colors. So you can play around with those things as well, but the built-in camera app, I would say, is already more than serviceable, especially in this sub-$100 price range. Now, one other benefit of the S9 camera that was a hardware feature was dual aperture. You can kind of make it out if we zoom all the way in here, but there is that physical kind of lens cap almost that will move over the camera sensor to let in more light or restrict light depending on the situation that you're in. Now the effect is very subtle though. I think it's more of a marketing ploy than anything, but still very cool to see that physical movement on the camera, something that was also retained on the S10 but then went away on the S20 and above as software started to really emulate what that hardware tried to do. With that being said, the variable aperture concept is still pretty cool, and these days a lot of other Chinese smartphone OEMs are bringing it back. Companies like Xiaomi, Oppo, Huawei are all starting to put those variable aperture cameras again on their newest 2023 flagships, so it's something that Samsung actually tried to experiment with back in 2018. A quick demo of the video and audio playback with the built-in speakers on YouTube. Alright, some takeaways would be that the Built-in speaker quality is really excellent. It's tuned with AKG's collaboration, and it has surprisingly a bit of depth as well, even in bass, and just extremely nice brightness as well as overall viewing angles. It's still a gorgeous display, to be honest, and pin sharp because of the Quad HD resolution. Another benefit of a flagship of yesteryear is smaller details like haptic vibration engine is also calibrated really well. Otherwise, we can see how quickly it loads back web pages, maybe not quite as quick as the 855, but still nothing to scoff at, and even complex pages like The Verge, lots of ads and video elements will still load up pretty quickly. Desktop sites can also load up just fine, and in general, it's still a very responsive experience. Again, not quite to the same level of the latest and greatest, but still perfectly serviceable and still feels quite comparable, in fact, to many, say, newer Snapdragon 700 series devices that you may find today. As for the basics, including phone calls and communications, as we talked about, this is a 4G LTE phone, but it still works perfectly fine. I didn't have any issues even when talking in louder outdoor environments. Callers were still able to hear my voice perfectly fine. Now, when it comes to gaming performance, in general, it still holds up better than expected for a phone of its age, and there is still nothing, again, from the Play Store that you aren't able to install and run, although of course slightly weaker compared to the Snapdragon 855 on the S10 series, but nothing to really scoff at, especially with this beautiful display, which is super sensitive. The Plus edition, again with a larger battery, does make a difference if you are trying to use it for longer continuous sessions versus the standard S9 and S8 for that matter, which both have smaller cells that can degrade quite quickly. You can definitely still play classics as well as games like Asphalt, PUBG without too many issues, especially if you lower some of the settings to something like medium. Here we have the phone connected by Type-C to a monitor and transforms it into that desk mode, which gives us access to a more conventional desktop-like experience when it comes to navigating around apps. Although not perfect, it's still a pretty cool software trick that you're able to use on Samsung Galaxy S series devices, for the most part with S8s and above. So that is more or less it as far as our revisited look at the Samsung Galaxy S9 Plus here in 2023. All in all, I would say it's still a surprisingly capable phone that has held up quite well, from the beautiful display to still a pretty responsive overall UI. Makes it a good contender now as a budget Android smartphone. With that being said, a few things to consider would be if you are willing to shell out a little bit more cash, I would say the S10 series will get you even more modern in terms of screen to body ratio, as well as having a more energy efficient chipset, which is also newer. So that is something to consider, especially if you're willing to make do with a slightly smaller phone than the S10e, again, can be bought for a pretty similar price. But still, this is a pretty impressive showing and not shabby at all in terms of the price that you can now find this thing at. You can check out additional details if you're interested in the links down below. For now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been a revisited look at the Galaxy S9 Plus.